He is the father of the European Investment Fund. He is the godfather of venture capital in Europe. Yes, that's right, you recognize him. This is Mr. John Holloway. Our CEO Nasir took a walk with him in a beautiful and sunny Luxembourg city centre. The conversation was fascinating. Did you know that when Mr. John Holloway started the EIF, there were only 4 people?
So John Holloway, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Nasir. It's great to be here.
What beautiful weather.
Glorious weather too, and yes.
Indeed, John. So you've worked at the European Investment Bank for over 20 years and then moved over to the European Investment Fund for about 18.
That's right.
Retired now, though still very, very active. You've been in Luxembourg for quite some time. How many years?
Well, it's exactly 41 years
41
this
years.
Week since my wife and I arrived here.
And you've chosen to retire here
Absolutely
as well.
right. Yeah. The infrastructure is here. It's a place we love.
41 years in Luxembourg.
Yep.
I mean, you've seen this place evolve tremendously over that time.
Incredible.
How has, I mean, this is now the biggest investment fund centre in Europe.
Yeah, over 4 trillion, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole sector has evolved incredibly. The fields, or where the EIB and the EIF reside, were fields, I think, when you probably came.
They were full of cows when I got here. Over the years, the place has transformed itself. So the best thing to do is to have finance. And that's what they started to do, combined with having quite a few European Union institutions here. I think what Luxembourg has managed to do in the meantime brilliantly well is to become a fund management specialist. And there, as you said, now the assets under management now are what, 4.5 trillion, makes it second or third biggest place in the world looking after funds. Luxembourg, I think, has become an excellent place to set up your fund, if that's what you want to do. Everyone speaks several languages. It's a small place, but it's utterly cosmopolitan. But the fact is, there's an openness in this country which you don't find in every other European Union country at all. And I find that a real pleasure. Fantastic place to be.
So, I mean, I think it was 1994, right? That
Yep.
The EIB set up the
Yep.
EIF under the dictate of the European Commission.
Correct.
And then I think in 1997 you expanded the remit from just pure private equity fund of funds into venture capital as well, right?
That's true.
And you were there right at the beginning. You became the director of private equity investments at the EIF. I think it was managing around 16 billion in funds, or approximately.
Towards the end, not at the beginning.
Invested in around, I think, 500 different investment managers. I mean, why did you choose to make that switch from the EIB into this?
The European Investment Fund was an idea that came out of the December 1992 Edinburgh Summit, hosted by John Major. At the time, Europe had just come through a fairly torrid downturn, economic downturn, and the idea came out in Edinburgh, December 92, to create a European Investment Fund. The idea would be that this European Investment Fund would be used to provide guarantees to banks financing the TENs, trans-European networks, so major infrastructure works, and also, completely the other end of the spectrum, loans to small, medium-sized businesses. The EIF started business in 1994. EIB was the biggest shareholder, 40%. The European Commission at the time, I think, had 30%. There were 80 financial institutions in Europe, most of them private sector. Took 20% of the capital, and there was 10% unallocated. And EIF started to do its business. And in 1997, it also opened up the small business side of its activity to private equity, at the same time as EIB did. 2000, EIB got a new president, Sir Brian Unwin, the Brit, went back to the UK, and the new president was Philip Maystadt, youngest finance minister Belgium had ever had. He was made president of EIB. His first big strategy point he came out with was he said he wanted to acquire a majority of the ownership of EIF, which he did. Set the ball rolling in the beginning of 2000, and EIB achieved about a 60% ownership. Commission stayed fixed at 30, 10% the other financial institutions. He then set about reorganising the strategies. So he said EIB does infrastructure, so we'll take that TENS portfolio, at the time it was about €1.5 billion, and the small business part would stay at EIF, and the equity business that EIB had started to do under the Amsterdam programme will be transferred to EIF.
Okay.
So President Maystadt asked me to go and see him, and he said, would I like to run the equity business? Would I like to run the equity business? Yes, absolutely. We moved in, four of us, moved in to do something with the equity business of EIF in September 2000. Over the following 18 years, with a super team of people, we took it from 4 people to 85, and from £500 million under management to 16 billion under management. 500 fund managers. I'm personally immensely proud of what EIF managed to achieve and continues to achieve now. And its development over those 20 years tracks the development of European venture capital at the same time, because EIF has contributed such a huge amount towards it. I don't think that the equity activity, venture capital tech activity in Europe today would be anything like as well founded as it is if EIF hadn't been there to give it a push, pull it along, and invest a huge amount of money and time. And the portfolio of EIF today, I think, is doing extremely well. It was a tremendous, tremendous ride. I said to Philip Maystadt, well, President, do you have a plan for EIF in September 2000? What would you like me to do? He just said to me, faites quelque chose, do something. Blank sheet of paper. Go away and do it. Do something. So I left his office and did something. I'm really intensely proud of it. And a lot of the people I started that journey with are still in EIF today. It's a business that just grabs you. It grabs you and it shakes you, and well, there you go. Because it's the people. Meet some incredible people. When you're sitting in front of a team of people who want your money, what are you looking for in them? What do you want to see? What differentiates this team from the one you saw last week, or the one you're going to say with a similar strategy next week? It's the people. Because the worst enemy of the venture capital is lack of stability. If you have team breakups, team collapses, then you've got real issues. You want them to stay together and be happy.
Since 2015, there's been about 122 billion deployed in European startups across about 48 countries by European VCs in 48 countries.
Wow.
And I think the EIF has invested in around 3,600 different companies indirectly as a fund of funds.
Yes,
yeah.
Fund of fund, yeah.
How have you seen this develop during your time? I mean, in terms of the VC industry in Europe and its appetite for investment, do you still see some barriers in the long term in terms of funding of companies?
The numbers, the statistics that you quote, Nasir, I don't doubt them, and I just find them absolutely humongous. If I compare with when I started this particular gig 20 years ago, they would have been absolutely unimaginable. In March 2000, the Neue Markt crashed in Frankfurt. A lot of people had piled into what they understood was venture capital and had lost a lot of money. The next big downturn was 2008, and the securitization problem hit everybody everywhere. People thought, well, there'll be lots of opportunities to buy companies cheap now, and what actually happened was that the GPs who were well funded, and that was most of them because they'd raised money on the back of good vintages 2005, 2006, just didn't do anything. They didn't sell anything because the valuations were perceived to be too low, and they couldn't buy anything because the valuations were perceived to be too low. Because during the period between 2010 and 2019, the industry managed to create the sort of numbers that you just quoted. And that in itself is, I think, utterly remarkable. COVID turned up. The effects of COVID in 2020, from what I can see, it's been bad, but perhaps not all that bad. That's really painting it with a very broad brush. Some things have not been good, other things have perhaps not been as bad as you would have expected. Valuations, for instance, the industry thrives on valuations. In 2008, EIF had to write its VC portfolio down by an average pretty much 35%, based on the last quarter. I don't think EIF will be doing anything like that for its accounting period 2020. I think what's happening for the GPs is it's very difficult on the issue which has probably been the most difficult is those GPs coming into the next fundraise cycle during 2020, because it's very difficult to access LPs. It's very difficult to do pitches and due diligences via Zoom. Certainly for first-time teams, it's frankly impossible. You've got to be in the room to feel that atmosphere in the room when you have a first-time team. It's not too bad if it's a very good well-known fund manager. On the other side, let's look at the limited partners. And I know the limited partners frequently take a real bashing for their attitude towards fundraising or them providing funds. A lot of it's probably well justified. But what have the LPs always done over time? They will commit when the market's high and they won't commit when the market's low, which time and time again, every vintage, the returns show is exactly the wrong way to do it. But they have to get things through their credit committees, and it's much easier when the market's high than when the market's low. So LPs generally are saying, COVID, I'm out of here. I don't want to know for the time being, I just can't do it, unless you're one of the absolute top-rated funds. That I see as being a real problem, but probably, short term. Because what I've really noticed over the 20 years of being attached to this industry is it's now become part of the furniture. It's an alternative asset. The strength of it is so much different. It is so much better than it was at the turn of the millennium. It's recognising that one of the biggest problems for the industry is the fund sizes still aren't big enough when compared to America. So if the fundraising is quite successful, but not quite as successful as we'd like it to be, then EIF might actually come in at the end of a deal rather than at the beginning. EIF has always thrived on what is called its catalysis. The catalysis is something which you would normally associate with being the front end.
Yeah.
But at the back end, what you're doing is boosting the size of that fund to enable it to go into bigger deals and stay in them in the follow-on rounds, which they weren't always able to do. So if I had to look at two ways of saying how's it been in this 20 years, I would say EIF switches from front end to back end, and COVID, which 10 years ago would have just wiped everything out, has not been sufficient to make everybody think that European VC is in a real mess. That's all.
I mean, there's still this big question that arises in European venture capital and I guess its impact on European startups. And that is why doesn't Europe have a star of the scale of, say, the Googles, the Amazons, Facebooks? When they start getting to later stage of funding, they typically go over to the US and they leave their home of Europe. Why is it that we don't have these unicorns?
I think it's also a question of scale. If I think back to, 2015 was the date you mentioned. I think in Europe in 2015 there might have been a dozen unicorns. Last year I think the number was 60, so say 5 times more. And in the intervening period some unicorns have been sold off, so they're no longer doing a valuation, which we all love, but we know it's a bit subjective, and it's actually objective because there's been some real cash achieved. So I don't think it's quite as bad now as it was 5 years ago. Your fundamental point that Europe has not been able to create anything like a Google or an Apple is absolutely, you can't argue about it, it's true. The reasons why, I honestly don't have an answer for you. All I can say is that the atmosphere, the infrastructure today that might lead to an Apple or a Google being founded in Europe is there. What it will take to just make that click is, I don't know. Europe has superb universities, as you say, it has researchers. It doesn't have the money the American market has. That for sure not. And if it's a question of money or is it a question of mentality, the American mentality is much vaunted for taking more risk.
So John, you have mentioned the B word a few times, Brexit.
Unavoidable, isn't it?
Unavoidable now it's all happened.
Yeah.
How has that, in your opinion, impacted the finance industry and I guess specifically then the venture industry?
Yeah.
What do you think the ramifications will be of Brexit?
Since June 2016, let's face it, we're coming up now to nearly 5 years since the referendum. Has there been a massive exodus from London? Certainly not. Has Luxembourg got a whole load of new companies? Some but not many. Have other parts of the European Union? No. I think people who are in London are sitting waiting, and they might set up a small operation in a European Union capital, but for the time being they're staying where they are because the infrastructure's there, the work is there, the workforce is there. And I think they all still believe that some kind of agreement will be reached that will allow some modicum of passporting, cooperation, whatever, to continue. The equity business, private equity venture capital business, well, historically, nearly a half of the business each year was done in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. Not all the money is deployed in the UK. The UK, I mean, I look at our sector, fintech and various other stuff, it's considered one of the bigger startup sectors in Europe.
Indeed, still is.
And given, say, EIF guidelines of committing money to the European Union or to the Eurozone,
absolutely.
That's going to change some dynamics in the VC industry, surely.
I think where EIF is concerned, EIF works in the member states.
Yeah.
And only in countries which are not member states if it has a specific okay from its shareholders. Britain leaving the European Union has certainly meant that Britain's access to EIF has been severely curtailed, no doubt about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that Britain would, or the EIF would not look at a British structure, but EIF is looking to see the end beneficiary. Who's the final beneficiary here? And the final beneficiary must be SMEs, small companies, tech companies, which are based in an EU of 27 members, not 28. UK-based VCs investing in continental Europe is certainly not a new thing. It's been done for a long time. It was growing consistently, and I don't think that the Brexit effect will be that they will stop looking for good opportunities because the opportunity happens to be in a country that's one of the 27. Most venture capital managers are pretty agnostic when it comes to politics. They want the best deal that fits their strategy and the geography where they think it can produce, sell, and for them to keep an eye on it relatively simply from wherever their home base is.
Yeah. And maybe we can get a few VCs to move to Luxembourg as well.
Who knows?
Yeah?
I think Luxembourg is very well known for some very big private equity companies and certainly for the work it does through back office and administration, etc. I don't think so far there's been a large number of GPs who've chosen to come and set up here, but I could see that changing.
It's been such a pleasure spending time with you this morning and hearing your insights on the venture capital investment industry here. I hope to see you soon in better times for a coffee.
Sure.
Really appreciate it all. Thank you so much. Let me just put this on.
Absolutely.
There we go. Take care. Have a great day, John. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.